to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Wendy Williams, and this is the lecture for Chapter 14, Applying Extinction. We'll be talking about using extinction in the real world. So let's talk about using extinction to eliminate real problems. We've already discussed what extinction is and how it works, and so here we'll briefly review and talk about how to use extinction to reduce or eliminate behavior. There are 6 basic steps to extinction that are outlined in Chapter 14. The first step is to conduct a functional behavioral assessment and to collect data to assess your treatment effect. If you remember, whenever we do any intervention, we always collect baseline data so that when we have data from the treatment condition, we can go back and compare it. So we need to understand the behavior, we need to understand what's going on, what the function of the behavior is, and then we need to begin to collect data during baseline so that later we can assess the treatment effect. We also use that period to identify, that period of the FBA, to identify the reinforcer that's maintaining the problem behavior. We want to make sure that we know what the reinforcer actually is. We try not to make any assumptions about what the reinforcer is. We want to be able to correctly identify the reinforcer so that we can then separate it from the behavior itself. That way the behavior never produces the reinforcer. We also, while we're in this process of FBA, we also want to consider the schedule of reinforcement. Has the behavior been reinforced continuously or only intermittently? It's going to make a difference in terms of how long it takes to eliminate the behavior. Remember that continuous reinforcement produces relatively rapid extinction. So those behaviors that have been reinforced continuously are much easier to eliminate through extinction than behaviors that have been reinforced only occasionally. Once we know what the reinforcer is and what the schedule is, and we have a good idea about how long it's going to take to extinguish the behavior, we can then begin treatment and begin to eliminate the reinforcer after every instance of the behavior. As we move forward through this process, we know to expect extinction bursts, but ultimately the behavior should start to decrease in frequency. You can facilitate that decrease by reinforcing alternative behaviors, by giving the client something else to do, and particularly alternative behaviors that produce the reinforcer that they use the problem behavior for. So if they're misbehaving to gain attention, giving them another way to gain attention can help facilitate the extinction of the misbehavior. And then finally, we want to make sure that we promote generalization. So we'd like to see extinction spread of that behavior spread to other relevant settings and around other relevant people. So if you do the extinction, for example, at home, we'd like to see the misbehavior start to decrease at school, out on the playground. We'd like to see the behavior start to fall out in more than one location. You may actually have to train that generalization by going into those new environments and establishing an extinction protocol. And then we want to work on maintaining the absence of that behavior that we've managed to eliminate. We like it to stay gone. So that may mean that you may have to train teachers how to maintain the extinction contingency. You may have to teach parents or siblings. So in order to get maintenance, there may be several things that you may need to do to make sure that the behavior actually stays at that new zero level. So let's just talk briefly about some of these. Collecting data on extinction. Behavior may be resistant to extinction at first, followed by a very sudden and immediate drop. So you may get, for example, when you place a behavior on extinction, it may increase with an extinction burst. It may stay a little high or up near baseline levels, and then it will drop suddenly. And one of the reasons why we collect data on extinction is that you need to be prepared to move ahead when this happens. So for example, if you need the behavior to go away, or at least begin to decline before you introduce new alternative behaviors, you want to introduce those behaviors as soon as the behavior starts to decline. Graphed data makes behavior change clear to intervention specialists or the change agent. So we really need to graph every day. It's important to graph immediately after every session and get your data down so you can see on the graph how you're doing. It lets you detect changes in the behavior frequency, duration, or intensity immediately. And that will allow you to move on to the next stage of treatment, whether that's training alternative behaviors or identifying other behaviors that may need intervention. Identifying the reinforcer, of course, is just critical to the use of extinction. We use our observations during the functional behavioral assessment to identify what exactly is supporting or maintaining the problem behavior or the target behavior. It's important not to make assumptions. I've said this before. Use the data from your reinforcers that effectively maintain the behavior. And then look for different types of reinforcement. Don't look simply for what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, oh, that behavior is being maintained by attention, and then only look for attention. And what you may miss out on are other forms of reinforcement. Remember that reinforcement can be social. So attention or positive reinforcement through through praise, negative reinforcement through escape, all mediated by other people. But it's also possible that the behavior could also be reinforced automatically. Remember that some reinforcers have to do with sensory stimulation, and that is a whole different ballgame when you're talking about extinction. It's one thing to change how people interact with your client. It's another thing to change how the environment interacts with the client. So you need to be very careful. Behavior can have several functions, and it could also be context dependent. It may be one kind of reinforcer that's maintaining it in one environment and something else in another. If you miss a context or you miss the reinforcer in a particular context, the behavior may not decrease. You might be able to eliminate an inappropriate behavior, tantruming or crying or being belligerent in a classroom because you recognize that what's maintaining the behavior is the teacher's attention or the students, the peers' attention. And you may be able to go in and eliminate those by having a conversation with them and explaining that we need to not pay attention to this behavior, and it may disappear. But if the same behavior is being used at home to escape demands, and not necessarily for attention, then you may see the behavior decline in the classroom, but it won't change at home. So you need to be looking at different types of reinforcement across the different settings and identify whether you have context-dependent differences. So that'll be important. I'm going to give you some examples. Probably the most famous behavior analyst when it comes to the study of self-injury is Dr. Brian Iwata from the University of Florida. He's been in the field for 40 years. He is a world-renowned behavior analyst, and he and some colleagues, including the author of your book, did some functional behavioral assessments and functional behavior analyses with several individuals and looked at several children and looked at what was maintaining their behavior. And the behavior that he was looking at was self-injury. So, and he discovered that some individuals will self-injure in order to get attention from adults, while others may use self-injury to escape educational demands. If you remember from the Harry video, Harry would self-injure in order to get out of having to do educational activities. And then there's also the possibility of automatic sensory stimulation. And he found that some individuals, self-injury is maintained by one of these three different possible sources of reinforcement. It's also possible for a single individual to engage in a similar self-injurious behavior in three different contexts for three different reasons. So it can be quite complex. What I can tell you is self-injury is often associated with autism, although it does occur with other developmental and intellectual disabilities. The research shows that nearly 50% of people with autism will engage in self-injury at some point in their life. And at any given point in time, if you go out and do a survey or do an assessment, you'll find that approximately 25% of them are currently engaged in self-injury. Only about 5 to 10% at any given time of those individuals engage in what we call life-threatening self-injurious behaviors. So like Harry, his self-injury was not life-threatening. But it was inappropriate. But there are individuals who could engage in very, very dangerous self-injury. It's a small percentage of those individuals, of people with autism, but it's still an important population that need special interventions. So the goal here is to eliminate the reinforcer. And when attention is the reinforcer, if the self-injury is not life-threatening, then the job of the intervention specialist is first to protect the child physically. So protect their head, make sure they're not going to hurt themselves seriously. And then the treatment is basically to not provide attention during the self-injury. So you allow them to self-injure, but they don't get any attention. But you do provide attention in the absence of self-injury when they're engaging in other behaviors. When escape is the reinforcer, if the self-injury is not life-threatening, then you continue to present the educational demands or tasks. Again, you have to protect the child in terms of safety, so you want to make sure they're not going to hurt themselves. And you can use minimal physical guidance to prevent them from escaping. So keeping them in their chair, and provide reinforcement for engaging in other activities or engaging and completing the educational task that you have them doing. So whatever the activity is, you have them participate in that activity to some degree and then provide reinforcement. Now, let me give you an example. When you're dealing with food refusal, and you have a child that begins to self-injure, and in order to escape the table and leave because they don't want to eat, you would continue to present the food. You would continue to get them either to feed themselves, or you would continue to feed them or attempt to feed them. You might need to use some physical restraint to hold them, keep them at the table, or keep them in their high chair. And then you would provide positive reinforcement when they take a bite. And you may not require that they eat the entire meal. This may be a situation where you need to use a changing criterion design where you start out small and then you start to introduce different foods and more foods, and you gradually eliminate the escape behavior and reinforce progressively more diverse and more amounts of food. When sensory stimulation is the reinforcement, it's a little bit more tricky. As long as the self-injury is not life-threatening, if they're not hurting themselves, you may need, again, to have the child wear a helmet if necessary to protect them. Interestingly, helmets are very common for teaching sensory, for extinguishing sensory reinforcement for self-injury, because the helmet can reduce the sensory feedback. It can actually change the way the behavior of self-injury or the behavior of self-stimulation feels, and it's not as reinforcing, and the children give up on it because they don't like it as much. There are other forms of sensory minimization, such as having individuals wear gloves or having padded floors or padded tables. If self-injury is life-threatening, then you do need, in all of these cases, if the self-injury has the potential to be life-threatening. So when you have kids who are banging their heads on concrete floors or against the corners of tables, then you may decide that extinction is too slow and that it's too risky, and so you're going to have to use something other than extinction to eliminate the behavior. One of the big issues is if you're training staff members to use extinction, will they all use it consistently? Will they all use it appropriately? And when you have too many adults who are engaging with the individual, you might decide that it's just too variable and too slow and too risky, and you're just not going to use extinction. All of these, extinction can be used for all three of these types of reinforcement: for attention, for escape, and for sensory stimulation, but only as long as the behavior that they're engaging in is not life-threatening or going to do major physical damage. And if it is, then extinction is no longer an option. So you have to ask, when is extinction actually safe to use? It's not if the problem behavior is life-threatening or it risks serious permanent physical damage to the client. It's not an option if the problem behavior puts other people at risk. So if the behavior isn't self-injurious, but it's aggressive and dangerously aggressive. It's also, you can't use extinction if an extinction burst is too risky. So you might say, gee, the behavior's bad, but if there's an extinction burst and the behavior escalates and it could become physically damaging or life-threatening, then you can't use extinction either. In any situation where allowing the problem behavior would be considered unethical, then you can't use extinction. And it's also true that if the family or the school or the teacher are not willing to use extinction, if they're not willing to maintain the new extinction rules after you leave, you train them and they go, I don't want to do this, then there's no reason to even begin using extinction unless you think you can shift to something else. You have to make sure that the behavior is not risky. Here I have just a few pictures of people interacting with others. So aggressive behaviors. Places where you see this are children who are aggressive to other children, children who might be aggressive to adults. And this is not simply for children, but it can also be used with adults. You could be working with a population of people with dementia or Alzheimer's who have become self-injurious or aggressive, and nursing staff, you have to protect them as well, care staff and nursing staff. So we have to be very clear that no one's going to get hurt if we decide to use extinction. There are 5 important questions that you need to ask about extinction whenever you're deliberating whether or not extinction is something that you want to consider using. And of course, the first one is, have you correctly identified the reinforcer, and can it be eliminated? Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. Is it safe to use? Also, very important. Can the extinction burst be tolerated? And will you be able to maintain the use of extinction over procedures on to care staff or parents or teachers? Remember to check for the schedule of reinforcement. Behaviors that have a history of intermittent reinforcement are going to be very resistant to extinction. Doesn't mean it's impossible. You can still extinguish the behavior, but it will take longer. You can have more than one extinction burst. You may struggle with spontaneous recovery. You may do very well one day, and when you come back, the behavior is back up again, and you'll have to proceed through extinction all over again before the behavior finally falls out. It could take several weeks instead of just several sessions. Use your FBA interview to determine the schedule of reinforcement. So when you sit down to do your interviews before you do your direct observations and you talk to the staff, you want to ask them, has the behavior been treated using other methods? How successful were they? Has the behavior returned after previous attempts to use extinction? And how often does a target behavior produce reinforcement? All of those things are going to be important when you are planning out your extinction protocol. You may need to move the behavior to continuous reinforcement before you begin extinction. Remember, if it's on intermittent reinforcement, it's going to be very resistant. So you might actually take a period of time where the behavior continues to be effective, but you make sure that it is effective every single time it's used and immediately. And what this does is, if you're able, as long as the behavior is not dangerous, you allow them to continue the behavior briefly, but shift them to a continuous reinforcement schedule. And what it does is it can accentuate the difference between reinforcement and when extinction begins, so that when they move from reinforcement to extinction, the difference is huge. They're used to having this behavior work all the time, and that makes the extinction conditions more salient and easier to kind of see that something's changing and understand that the rules have changed. Finally, remember that it's much easier to replace a behavior than it is to simply eliminate it. Alternative behaviors, alternative appropriate behaviors, can really help facilitate your extinction protocol. The truth is, extinction only teaches you that your old behavior is broken and that it no longer works. But it doesn't actually teach you what you can do that would be appropriate instead. So by having positive reinforcement for appropriate alternative behaviors ready for training, the individual will learn, oh, it's easier for me to do this appropriate behavior and get my reinforcer than it is to fight my extinction, to fight the extinction of this behavior. So we don't just build a dam when there's a river. We don't just build a dam because if you do, the dam will flood. The same is true with behavior. You can't just build a dam by putting up extinction. If you say that you can't get through this area anymore, this path doesn't work anymore, with enough behavioral momentum, the behavioral dam will flood. So provide an easier and more appropriate way to earn the desired reinforcer, and you'll find that behavior is like water. It follows the path of least resistance. That's it for Chapter 14, and good luck on the exam, and we'll meet again next week for our next series of sessions. Have a good day.